Good morning or afternoon, wherever you may be. This is our week 2 discussion covering the readings for January 8th and through January 14th, but we're going to just do a quick review of the end of last week. Just a reminder that we are all descendants of Noah. Noah's 3 sons, we learned, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. I did not discuss this fact last time, but just recognize that Ham, the Hamitic peoples, became, the sons were Cush and Canaan, became the Ammonites. Nimrod was the son of Cush. So these are the peoples who mostly ended up in the Middle East area, mostly, and farther south into Africa. Japheth's sons, Magog, Gomer, and Javan, one of which is clearly identified as being the parents of the Greeks. These are, and I would note that Gomer is the father of Ashkenaz, and Ashkenaz is always associated with Eastern Europe. So this is apparently the peoples that migrated into Europe and on into the Far East. Leaving the son Shem, whom is really the center feature, or the center focus of the biblical reading, because he was the father of Arphaxad, Eber, then Terah, the father of Abraham, and then Abram himself. I would note that I have read elsewhere, and I could not find documentary evidence of this during the last few days, but I believe Eber is the reason we are frequently referring to them as Hebrews. They are sons of Eber. And of course, we know that only Abram was actually selected by God. And then the other thing we want to be sure we understand is that at the time of the flood, of course, or immediately after the flood, that all 3 of these sons spoke the same language, and presumably all the sons of those sons also spoke the same language. But not too long after that, remember, they began to construct a tower in a city, and basically God did not care for their arrogant attitude that they had decided they had everything figured out. We have nothing to stand in our way was basically their attitude. And I mention that because that, of course, is the famous story of Babel. And our book, our Bible, the edited Bible that we're studying, tells us, as does any New International Version Bible, that in a footnote, that the word Babel means confused, or sounds like the word for confused in Hebrew, which I don't doubt. I have no knowledge of Hebrew. I have a minimal knowledge of Arabic, and to me, it sounds like Babel, the door to God. And I say that because I believe that it was this extreme arrogance that God smote in confusing the languages of the entire earth and creating the divisions between nations. And I mention that because, of course, we here in the United States are pretty much a proud nation, an arrogant nation. I think we might stand to learn from that. In any event, Terah, the 4th generation down from Shem, moved his family from the area around Babylon to Haran, which is farther upstream on the Tigris-Euphrates River drainage. And that's where Abram was living until he was called by God. Now, it's not entirely clear whether that call came when they were still in Babylon or only after they arrived in Haran. I'm not clear about that. I don't think the text is completely clear about that. But the reality is Abram was willing to listen to God and do what he told him to do. So Abram moved to the region of Canaan, which was occupied by others. This was several generations later, so there were many of Ham's and perhaps Shem's children also living in Canaan, and Abram moved to a place where the rest of his family was not. And notice that this is the start, if you will, of a recurring theme in the Bible. Canaan, or the Promised Land, let's just say that, the Promised Land, which is basically the West Bank and the area around Jerusalem, not quite to the seacoast. That Promised Land is where God's people were to reside. And there is a constant tension from now forward between the Promised Land and returning to the area of Shinar, to the area of Babylon, or moving to Egypt. And we'll see that happen back and forth, that the action moves from the Promised Land to Mesopotamia, it moves back to the Promised Land, it moves from the Promised Land to Egypt, it moves back to the Promised Land. So just watch for that. We'll be seeing that as we continue our reading through the Old Testament. And I believe the first time that Abram actively worshiped God occurred near Bethel. And Bethel, of course, also in Arabic, I don't know what it means in Hebrew, but house of God in Arabic. So I'd like to read a passage from a book that I have, the Jewish Chronicles. This is a book written by the notable, some of you will know him, by the notable Neil Fain. And I'm going to read a brief passage in this book that he wrote concerning Abram. The Lord promised he would make a great nation of Abram and make him a blessing to all the families of the nations. Genesis 12:2-3. God will bless whoever blesses Abram and God curse whoever curses him. God has made a decision up front that he would bless Abram. God knew how Abram was to turn out, and so he chose him. So Abram left his homeland on a promise. This is the key point. He would never see in his earthly lifetime, and was faithful to that promise, which he could not see. That's pretty much, as we learn in the New Testament, the definition of faith. You can call this many things, but it was not living for this present world. Abram is called the father of the faithful. Would you leave at age 75 to go you know not where? They did take what they could. We're told in our reading that they took flocks and his nephew Lot. Then, when Abram got to Canaan, God appeared to him again and made him a promise that of all that land. There is much to tell about Abraham. The Bible tells us a great deal, and not all of it is by any means flattering. One Jewish author said about the prophets, they were men with a nature like ours. You do not have to be perfect for God to love you. You can be an ordinary, miserable, fallible human being and have God love you and even protect you. I don't know about all of us, but I know I personally am greatly encouraged by the fact that many of Abraham's flaws, I switch off on pronunciation, incidentally. I'm convinced from talking to Jewish people that Abram and Abraham are the pronunciations they would use, but we always say Abraham. And God changed his name. That's how it got to be that within our reading. So the fact is, I'm deeply encouraged by the fact that Abraham was flawed. We're told of several of his deceitful ideas or actions, and we pretty well know he had a messed up family. what can we say about putting the fun back in dysfunctional? But the reality is, nonetheless, he wanted to do God's will. And to highlight that, I'd like to bring your attention to the Sodom and Gomorrah story. I would note to you that in the reading, 3 men appear. 3. And later, only 2 men, 2 angels, identified as angels, go down to Sodom and meet with Lot. So who was the 3rd man? Well, as I read it, that 3rd man, 3rd being, had to be God. It was the Lord. And it seems to me that had to be the first manifestation of Jesus on earth. But that's unknowable. But I think it's interesting. We are seeing here Abraham speaking directly to God. I would also note that Lot's daughters, this happened after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, gave birth to the Moabites and the Ammonites, and those 2 nations will feature prominently in the reading this week. And finally, I would note that Abraham's sons are Ishmael. He had the 2 sons, Ishmael, which was by an external relationship, not with his wife Sarah, and Isaac. And of course, in our reading, the most horrible event, not quite, but a very terrible event in which God tells Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. Obviously, Abraham understood that's what God was telling him to do. He did not understand why or what this meant, but he agreed to follow through with God's demands. And I think we need to recognize that that's what made him the father of the faithful. And as we know, he did not, in fact, sacrifice Isaac. So with that, I think it's interesting that we'll see in this reading that Isaac is then sent back to Haran to seek a wife. So we have the first of the Canaan to Mesopotamia trips. And this will happen again and again, multiple times as we go through the stories. But the reality is, Abraham is the first man who is identified as actively striving to do God's will throughout his life. And we need to strive to do the same thing. So with that, we move on to our next reading for next week. Thank you for joining us, and hopefully we'll all be able to stay ahead.